Late one evening, deep in the bowels of St. Vincent's General Hospital, a nurse named Claire found herself working the night shift alone in the ICU. The ward was unusually quiet. Her colleagues joked that nights like these were calm before the storm. But Claire had worked there long enough to know quiet could be dangerous. Hospitals are filled with echoes, footsteps, the hum of machines, and distant voices. But that night, the air carried an unnatural stillness, as though something unseen held its breath. Claire's unease began when a patient named Mr. Bell, admitted earlier for a routine surgery, began behaving oddly. Around 2 a.m., his heart monitor spiked alarmingly, though his vitals moments before had been stable. Claire rushed to his room, only to find him sitting upright in bed, staring at the corner of the ceiling. His lips moved silently, his eyes wide with terror. She checked his IV and gently called his name, but he didn't respond. Instead, he began whispering, barely audible. "It's watching," he rasped. Claire followed his gaze but saw nothing. The monitor screamed again as his heart rate climbed, and before she could react, he let out a gut-wrenching scream and flatlined. The code team rushed in, reviving him after several minutes. But when he came to, his eyes brimmed with fear. He grabbed Claire's wrist with surprising strength and muttered, "It's in the walls." Later that night, Claire reviewed Mr. Bell's chart at the nurse's station, trying to make sense of his outburst. That's when she noticed a shadow flicker at the edge of her vision. She looked up and scanned the corridor. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, casting their sterile glow on the empty hallway. She dismissed it as exhaustion and returned to her notes. But the shadow returned, this time darker, more distinct. It moved against the light, sliding along the wall like a liquid stain. Claire's pulse quickened. She called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" Her voice echoed, unanswered. Determined not to let her nerves get the best of her, she walked toward the spot where she'd seen it. As she approached, the air grew colder, and a faint, acrid smell, something like burning hair, filled her nostrils. She felt a pressure in her chest, as if the building itself were leaning in on her. Turning a corner, she saw room 316, an empty isolation room that hadn't been used in months. Yet its door was ajar, a faint light flickering within. Against her better judgment, she stepped inside. The smell was stronger here, almost suffocating. The monitor in the room blinked to life, displaying erratic lines as though a patient were hooked up. Claire felt an overwhelming urge to leave, but her legs felt like lead. And then she heard it, a faint, wet sound, like something dragging itself across the floor. It was coming from the supply closet in the room. The door creaked open just enough to reveal darkness beyond. A cold, slimy hand reached out, its fingers impossibly long, scraping the floor as it pulled itself forward. Its face, or what might have been its face, was a writhing mass of blackened flesh and hollow eyes that burned with a malevolent intelligence. Claire screamed and bolted from the room, her heart pounding so loudly she could barely hear the clatter of her shoes against the tile. When she reached the nurse's station, the lights overhead flickered violently. Alarms sounded from every room. Patients were convulsing, monitors blaring out in chaotic unison. Claire felt a suffocating presence behind her, but she didn't dare turn around. The chaos abruptly stopped. Silence descended again, thick and heavy. Claire turned slowly, her breath shallow. The shadow loomed large, its edges dissolving into the air like smoke. It whispered something unintelligible, a guttural sound that felt like it was crawling inside her skull. She collapsed to the floor, unconscious. When Claire woke up hours later, the ICU was bustling with its usual morning activity. Nurses and doctors moved about as though nothing had happened. Her colleagues insisted they'd found her fainted at the station, and the monitors in the rooms had been functioning normally all night. Claire handed in her resignation that day. She couldn't explain what she had experienced, but she knew one thing for sure. Whatever had haunted her that night wasn't human. Weeks later, a maintenance worker was found dead in room 316. His face was frozen in terror, his fingernails bloody from clawing at the walls. Rumors spread among staff, but the administration dismissed them as wild tales. To this day, room 316 remains closed, its doors sealed and marked as under renovation. But those who pass it swear they hear faint whispers from within, calling their names. Deep in the Appalachian Mountains, there stood a crumbling psychiatric hospital known as Black Hollow Asylum. Long abandoned, the facility was shrouded in local legends, whispers of experiments gone wrong, and a malevolent presence that lingered in its dark halls. Few dared to enter, but those who did often came out changed, if they came out at all. The story begins with a group of urban explorers, Mark, Rachel, Ian, and Carla, who decided to spend the night inside the asylum. Armed with flashlights and cameras, they laughed nervously as they made their way through the rusted gates and into the sprawling, decaying structure. The air inside was damp and cold, the walls adorned with peeling paint and cryptic messages scrawled in ancient graffiti. Their goal was the basement. According to local lore, the lower levels had been sealed off after a mass escape in the 1930s. Patients reportedly vanished into thin air, and the staff who pursued them were never seen again. The basement was said to be the epicenter of the asylum's dark energy. As they descended the stairwell, the light from their flashlights seemed to dim unnaturally, swallowed by the oppressive darkness. The air grew colder, and an unsettling silence replaced the faint creaks and groans of the old building. The group reached a heavy iron door, marked with the words, "Do not open," scrawled in rust-red letters. The lock had long since been broken, and the door creaked open with an agonizing wail. Inside, the basement was a labyrinth of narrow corridors, each lined with tiny cells. Mark noted how each cell still contained remnants of its former inhabitants, moth-eaten mattresses, restraints bolted to the walls, and, disturbingly, deep gouges in the metal doors. "They tried to get out," Rachel whispered, her voice trembling. As they moved deeper, Carla's flashlight flickered and died. Mark handed her his spare, but the moment she clicked it on, the beam illuminated a figure standing at the end of the hall. It was a man, or what once had been a man. His body was emaciated, his limbs unnaturally long, and his head cocked at an impossible angle. His eyes glowed faintly, and his mouth twisted into a grotesque grin. "Who's there?" Mark called out, but the figure didn't move. Instead, it let out a guttural moan that echoed through the corridors. Then, with a speed that defied logic, it vanished into the shadows. Panic set in. The group argued about whether to press on or leave, but their discussion was interrupted by a low, rhythmic banging. It came from multiple directions, as though the walls themselves were alive. Ian shone his flashlight toward the sound and froze. The gouges in the walls were bleeding, dark rivulets seeping down to pool on the floor. Then came the laughter. It started soft, almost childlike, but grew into a cacophony of overlapping voices. Mocking, angry, pleading. The air became thick, choking them with the stench of decay. Carla screamed as something cold and wet brushed against her hand, but when she turned, no one was there. The group sprinted back the way they'd come, only to find the stairwell gone, replaced by another endless corridor. Their panic turned to hysteria as the building seemed to shift around them, doors slamming shut and walls pressing closer. The laughter turned into screams, inhuman and deafening. Mark was the first to disappear. One moment he was behind them, the next he was gone, his flashlight rolling on the ground. Rachel and Ian frantically called his name, but all they heard was a faint, wet, gurgling sound. Then Carla began muttering under her breath, her eyes wide and unseeing. "They're here," she whispered. "They've always been here." She dropped to her knees, clawing at her own face as though trying to peel something away. Before Ian could stop her, she let out a blood-curdling scream and collapsed, her body convulsing violently. When she went still, her face was frozen in an expression of abject terror, her eyes staring blankly at nothing. Ian and Rachel fled blindly through the maze of corridors, their flashlights flickering as the darkness seemed to close in around them. They could hear whispers now, their own names spoken in raspy, unnatural tones. Rachel tripped and fell, and when Ian turned to help her, she was gone. Nothing but her flashlight left behind, its beam pointing at a wall covered in fresh, bloody handprints. Ian stumbled into a large room, his breath ragged. The room was empty, save for an old wooden chair in the center. On the chair sat a tape recorder, its reel spinning. With trembling hands, Ian pressed play. A deep, distorted voice crackled through the speaker. "You shouldn't have come." Before Ian could react, the door slammed shut behind him. The last thing he saw was his own reflection in a shattered mirror on the wall, only it wasn't his face staring back. Weeks later, local authorities found the group's car parked outside the asylum. Inside the building, they discovered the explorers' equipment scattered throughout the basement. But of the four friends, no trace was ever found, except for the tape recorder, which played nothing but the sound of laughter when turned on. The small, remote hospital sat on the edge of a dense forest, miles from the nearest town. It had been there for decades, serving as a last resort for the injured and the dying in the region. Staff came and went, but the stories about the hospital's night shifts remained, a whispered warning passed down among the employees. No one liked working nights, and those who did often left after only a few shifts. Mara was new, fresh out of nursing school and eager to prove herself. When she was assigned her first overnight shift, she dismissed the rumors about strange occurrences as superstition. Ghost stories didn't scare her. Medicine was science, and science didn't leave room for nonsense like haunted hospitals. The night began uneventfully, with Mara checking on the few patients admitted to the ward. Most were elderly, sedated, or fast asleep. As the hours dragged on, the hospital grew unnervingly silent. The only sounds were the rhythmic beeping of monitors and the occasional shuffle of her footsteps down the hall. Around 2 a.m., Mara noticed something strange. One of the rooms at the far end of the corridor, room 311, had its light on. She frowned. That room was unoccupied, its bed stripped bare. She could have sworn it had been dark earlier. Maybe she'd left the light on during her rounds. She walked down the hall and peeked inside. The room was empty, just as she expected. Mara flipped the switch, plunging it into darkness again, and turned to leave. But as she reached the doorway, she heard it. A faint whisper, barely audible over the hum of the ventilation system. "Help me." Mara froze. The voice was weak, trembling, and undeniably human. It came from behind her, inside the room. She spun around, heart pounding, and shone her flashlight across the space. The room was still empty. "Hello?" she called out, her voice shaky. No response. She told herself it was her imagination, nerves getting the better of her. Shaking her head, she closed the door and walked away. Minutes later, the nurse's station phone rang. Mara answered, relieved for the distraction. "Hello, this is the night nurse." A raspy voice came through the line, faint but chilling. "Why did you leave me alone?" Mara's blood ran cold. She hung up the phone and stared at it, willing it not to ring again. She tried to convince herself it was a prank, but who could it have been? The only people in the hospital were her patients, all of whom were either unconscious or too frail to move. She decided to double-check the ward. Room after room, she found nothing unusual. But when she reached room 311 again, the door was ajar. She hadn't left it that way. Gathering her courage, she stepped inside. The air was icy, and the fluorescent light overhead flickered ominously. On the bed, where there had been nothing earlier, lay a patient chart. Mara picked it up and felt a shiver run down her spine. The name on the chart was Margaret Taylor. The photo attached was old and faded, but the woman's face stared back at her with hollow, lifeless eyes. The chart said Margaret had died in this hospital 50 years ago, in room 311. Mara stumbled backward, dropping the chart. It landed face up, and she saw something new scrawled in shaky, dark handwriting at the bottom. "I'm still here." Panicking, she left the room and returned to the nurse's station, determined to finish her shift without venturing back down that corridor. But the strange occurrences didn't stop. A cold breeze brushed past her in the closed-off ward. The sound of faint footsteps echoed behind her, but no one was there when she turned around. Then the elevator at the end of the hall dinged. Its doors slid open, revealing no one inside. But the button for the basement was lit, as if someone had just pressed it. The basement was off limits, supposedly sealed years ago after a flood damaged the lower levels. Mara ignored it, focusing on the paperwork in front of her. But the elevator dinged again, and again. Each time, the basement button glowed brighter, almost as if daring her to come. Finally, unable to stand the relentless noise, she decided to investigate. Armed with her flashlight, she stepped into the elevator, her finger hesitating over the closed door button. But before she could press it, the doors slid shut on their own, and the elevator jolted to life, descending to the basement. The air grew colder as the elevator stopped, its doors creaking open to reveal pitch-black darkness. Mara stepped out, her flashlight beam cutting through the oppressive void. The basement was a maze of abandoned rooms and storage units, littered with decayed furniture and rusted equipment. In the distance, she heard it again. the faint, pleading voice. "Help me." Mara followed the sound, her heart pounding with every step. It led her to an old operating theater, its surgical lights dangling precariously from the ceiling. A shadow shifted in the corner. Her flashlight revealed an old gurney, and on it lay a figure covered by a sheet. Compelled by some unseen force, Mara approached the gurney and pulled back the sheet. There was nothing underneath except the faint outline of a body scorched into the mattress, as if burned there. She stumbled back, and the whispers turned into screams, echoing all around her. Lights flickered violently, and the air grew thick with the stench of burning flesh. Mara turned to run, but the door slammed shut, trapping her inside. A figure emerged from the darkness, its form barely human, its face a grotesque mask of melted skin and hollow eyes. It raised a hand, pointing directly at her. "You left me to die," it rasped, the voice layered with 100 others. Mara screamed, the flashlight slipping from her grasp as the figure lunged. Everything went black. When the morning staff arrived, they found the hospital in disarray. Equipment was scattered and the nurse's station was empty. Mara was never found, but the elevator continued to behave strangely, stopping on the basement floor even though the doors were welded shut. To this day, staff swear they hear whispers coming from room 311 and the faint ding of the elevator at night. No one dares investigate. In the heart of a snow-blanketed rural town, St. Mary's Community Hospital sat eerily quiet. Winter storms often left the hospital sparsely staffed, with only a skeleton crew to tend to the few patients who braved the icy roads to get there. On this particular night, the wind howled against the windows, and the town's power grid had failed, leaving the hospital running on backup generators. The faint hum of emergency lights added an unsettling edge to the already tense atmosphere. Nurse Abigail, a seasoned professional with years of experience, was working the night shift alone. Most of the patients were either stable or sedated, and the few others were discharged earlier in the day in preparation for the storm. The only occupied room was room 7, where an elderly woman named Mrs. Holden was recovering from a severe bout of pneumonia. Mrs. Holden had been an odd case since her arrival. She would mutter incoherently to herself, claiming she could see visitors standing by her bed at night. The doctors attributed it to her high fever and oxygen deprivation. Abigail, however, couldn't shake the uneasy feeling Mrs. Holden gave her, especially tonight. As midnight approached, Abigail performed her routine checks. When she entered room 7, Mrs. Holden was wide awake, staring intently at the corner of the room. Her oxygen mask fogged up with each shallow breath, her eyes wide and unblinking. "Mrs. Holden, is everything all right?" Abigail asked softly. "They're here," the old woman whispered, her voice trembling. "They've come for me." Abigail glanced at the empty corner. "No one's here, Mrs. Holden. It's just us." Mrs. Holden's gaze didn't waver. "You can't see them, but they see you. They see everything." Unsettled but trying to remain professional, Abigail adjusted the woman's oxygen levels and reassured her. "Try to rest. I'll check on you again soon." As Abigail left the room, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her. She chalked it up to Mrs. Holden's eerie behavior and moved on with her duties. But as she returned to the nurse's station, she noticed something odd. The hallway that had been lit moments before was now completely dark, the emergency lights in that section flickering weakly. A deep sense of dread settled in her chest as she grabbed her flashlight. The storm must be messing with the generator, she thought. She made her way cautiously down the corridor to check the breaker panel. As she passed the rooms, she heard faint tapping sounds, first from one door, then another. She stopped in her tracks, shining her flashlight on the nearest door. The tapping stopped. "Hello?" she called, her voice echoing unnaturally. No answer. As she reached the breaker panel, she opened it and found nothing out of the ordinary. She flipped a few switches, but the lights remained dead. That's when she noticed it. Faint, wet footprints leading away from the breaker panel and down the hall. The prints were small, as though made by bare feet. Abigail's stomach churned. No one should be walking around barefoot in this weather, or at all. Gripping her flashlight tighter, she followed the footprints. They led her to room 7. Mrs. Holden's door was ajar, and the room was dark except for the faint glow of the oxygen monitor. Abigail stepped inside cautiously, her flashlight beam cutting through the shadows. The bed was empty. "Mrs. Holden?" Abigail whispered, her voice trembling. There was no response. only the soft hiss of oxygen escaping from the tubing. Then, from the corner of the room, she heard a faint rustling sound. Abigail swung her flashlight toward it, illuminating a dark, hunched figure. It wasn't Mrs. Holden. The thing crouched there was pale and emaciated, its limbs grotesquely elongated. Its head tilted at an unnatural angle, and its eyes gleamed like wet glass in the beam of her flashlight. Abigail stumbled backward, her scream caught in her throat. The figure grinned, revealing jagged, yellow teeth, and in a voice that sounded like Mrs. Holden's, it rasped, "They came for me, but now they want you." The lights in the room flickered violently, and the figure lunged toward her. Abigail screamed and bolted down the hall, her flashlight bouncing wildly. She made it back to the nurse's station and slammed the door behind her, locking it with trembling hands. The generator lights flickered, casting shadows that seemed to move on their own. Abigail grabbed the phone to call for help, but the line was dead. The tapping started again, louder this time, coming from the other side of the locked door. Suddenly, the tapping stopped, replaced by a slow, deliberate scraping sound, like fingernails dragging down the wood. Abigail backed away, clutching a pair of scissors as her only weapon. The scraping stopped, and the room fell silent. Abigail held her breath, waiting. Then, with a deafening crash, the door burst open, and the last thing she saw was the grinning face of the thing that wore Mrs. Holden's voice. When the storm passed and the morning staff arrived, they found the hospital eerily silent. Abigail was nowhere to be found. Room 7 was empty, the bed neatly made, and the oxygen monitor turned off. The only clue was a trail of wet footprints leading from the room to the nurse's station, where a pair of scissors lay on the floor, slick with blood. The storm had been raging for hours, relentless and deafening when the call came in. A car accident on the highway. A single survivor being transported to Pine Ridge Hospital. The hospital was small, understaffed, and isolated on nights like this. Only Dr. Miller, a seasoned emergency physician, and a nurse named Julia were on duty. The patient arrived around midnight. He was a man in his late 30s, soaked in rain and barely conscious. His injuries weren't severe, some cuts, a few bruises, but his heart rate was erratic and his breathing shallow. What struck Julia most wasn't his condition, but his eyes, wide, glassy, and filled with terror. "Do you know your name?" Dr. Miller asked as they wheeled him into an examination room. The man's lips trembled. He barely managed to whisper, "It's coming." "What's coming?" Julia asked, trying to calm him as she took his blood pressure. The man gripped her wrist with surprising strength. "Don't let it in. Please, don't let it in." Before either of them could respond, the lights flickered, plunging the room into momentary darkness. The emergency generator hummed to life, but something about the dim, buzzing light made the hospital feel colder, emptier. Dr. Miller ordered tests and left to prepare the imaging equipment, leaving Julia alone with the patient. She tried to reassure him, but his condition worsened rapidly. His breathing grew labored, his body convulsing as if he were choking on air. Panicking, Julia ran to get Dr. Miller, but when they returned moments later, the man was gone. The bed was empty, the IV torn from his arm. Blood droplets led out of the room and into the darkened hallway. "That's impossible," Dr. Miller muttered, grabbing a flashlight. He was too weak to walk. They followed the trail, their footsteps echoing unnervingly in the silence. The blood led to the hospital's east wing, which had been closed for years due to budget cuts. The wing was in disrepair, its walls cracked and paint peeling, the air thick with the smell of mildew. As they ventured deeper, the sound of faint, wet footsteps echoed ahead of them. Julia called out, "Hello, sir, are you there?" But her voice only bounced back at her. The trail ended abruptly at a locked door marked morgue. The room hadn't been used in years. The staff preferred the newer facility on the main floor. Dr. Miller hesitated, then pulled out a key from his pocket and unlocked the door. The morgue was freezing. Their breath fogged the air as they stepped inside. The old gurneys were covered in dust, and the faint metallic smell of decay lingered. At the far end of the room stood a single autopsy table, its surface clean despite the years of abandonment. "Where could he have gone?" Julia whispered, shivering. The answer came in the form of a low, guttural sound, a mix of a growl and a moan. It came from the shadows near the back of the room. Dr. Miller swung the flashlight toward the noise, and the beam caught something crouched there. At first, Julia thought it was the patient, But as the figure rose to its full height, she realized it was far too tall, its limbs unnaturally long and twisted. Its face was human, but wrong, stretched as though the skin were too tight over its skull. Its eyes glowed faintly, like embers in the dark, and its mouth curled into an impossibly wide grin filled with sharp, uneven teeth. Before either of them could move, the thing lunged. Julia screamed as it swiped at Dr. Miller, its claws raking across his chest. He collapsed to the ground, gasping and clutching at the deep gashes. Julia turned and ran, her flashlight bouncing wildly in her trembling hands. She could hear it behind her, its footsteps heavy and wet, its growl growing louder. She darted into a stairwell and slammed the door shut, her heart racing as she heard it scratching at the metal on the other side. She climbed the stairs frantically, emerging on the main floor. She needed to call for help, but the hospital's phones were down and her cell had no signal in the storm. Desperation clawed at her mind as she sprinted back to the ER, hoping to find some kind of weapon. Instead, she found the patient. He was sitting calmly in the middle of the room, his injuries gone, his clothes dry and spotless. His head tilted as he smiled at her, a slow, unnerving smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You let it in," he said, his voice soft but filled with venom. "You shouldn't have let it in." Before she could respond, the lights flickered again, plunging the room into darkness. The last thing Julia heard before everything went silent was the sound of claws scraping across the floor, and her own scream. The storm cleared by morning, and when the next shift arrived, the hospital was empty. Dr. Miller, Julia, and the mysterious patient were never found. Security footage showed nothing unusual except for one frame, a dark, shadowy figure standing at the entrance, grinning into the camera. The hospital closed its doors permanently a few months later. Locals say the building is cursed, that strange lights and shadows can be seen inside on stormy nights. And if you listen closely, they say, you can still hear the faint sound of claws dragging across the walls. The Crescent Pines Psychiatric Hospital had been abandoned for over 20 years, its shadowy silhouette perched ominously on the edge of a fog-covered hill. Once a beacon of hope for the mentally ill, it was now a crumbling ruin, a place of whispered legends and forgotten tragedies. Locals said that anyone who dared to enter never came back the same if they came back at all. Jason, a skeptical journalist, decided to investigate. He had heard the stories, screams in the night, shadows moving behind shattered windows, and the infamous disappearance of the last caretaker. Determined to debunk the rumors and make a name for himself, he packed his camera, flashlight, and notebook, then set out on a cold October evening. The front gate creaked loudly as Jason pushed it open. The air was still, the surrounding forest unnervingly silent. As he approached the main building, he noticed that the front doors were slightly ajar. The hospital loomed over him, its broken windows resembling jagged teeth, its peeling paint giving it the appearance of rotting flesh. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of mildew and decay. Jason's flashlight cut through the gloom, illuminating the graffiti-covered walls and shattered remnants of medical equipment. He took a few photos, jotting down notes about the eerie atmosphere. The first hour passed uneventfully. Jason explored patient rooms, the cafeteria, and even the old therapy rooms. Everything was silent, except for the occasional drip of water from the broken ceiling. He was beginning to think the stories were exaggerated until he reached the basement. The basement stairs were narrow and steep, the darkness below seeming to pulse like a living thing. Jason hesitated, but his curiosity won out. As he descended, the air grew colder, the faint smell of rot becoming overpowering. At the bottom of the stairs, he found himself in a long, dimly lit corridor. The walls were lined with old patient files, their paper yellowed and brittle. The floor was damp, and his boots squelched with every step. He shone his flashlight on a sign that read, Treatment Room 9. Jason opened the door. Inside was a small, sterile room, its centerpiece a rusted operating table with leather restraints. A single, cracked mirror hung on the wall, reflecting the beam of his flashlight in distorted fragments. He snapped a photo, the camera flash briefly illuminating the room in stark white light. As the flash faded, Jason froze. In the mirror, he saw movement. Something had darted across the reflection, a dark, humanoid figure. He spun around, his flashlight trembling in his grip, but the room was empty. "It's just my imagination," he muttered, forcing a nervous laugh. But as he turned back to the door, he noticed something else. The leather restraints on the table were now undone, dangling as if recently used. A faint sound reached his ears then, a whispering so soft he almost didn't hear it. He strained to listen, and the whispers grew louder, overlapping voices speaking in a language he couldn't understand. His heart raced as the voices seemed to come from all around him, echoing in the small room. "Hello?" Jason called out, his voice shaky. The whispers stopped. The silence was deafening, but it didn't last long. A sudden, ear-piercing scream shattered the quiet, reverberating through the basement. It sounded like a woman in agony, and it came from deeper within the corridor. Jason's journalistic instincts battled his fear. Against his better judgment, he followed the sound, each step feeling heavier than the last. The scream grew louder as he approached a heavy steel door at the end of the hall. The word "Asylum" was painted above it in faded red letters. He pushed the door open. Inside was a large, circular room with a high ceiling. In the center stood a single chair bolted to the floor, its leather straps worn and frayed. The walls were covered in jagged scratches, as if someone or something had tried to claw its way out. Jason aimed his flashlight at the chair. For a brief moment, he thought he saw a figure sitting there, a woman with hollow eyes and a mouth twisted in a silent scream. He blinked, and the chair was empty. A loud bang behind him made him whirl around. The steel door had slammed shut, and the whispers began again, this time louder and more insistent. The temperature in the room plummeted, his breath visible in the frigid air. Then the lights in the room flickered on, bright, buzzing fluorescent lights that shouldn't have worked in a building without power. Jason's flashlight went out, plunging him into darkness once more. He felt it before he saw it. A presence, heavy and oppressive, filled the room. Slowly he turned, and there it was, a figure towering over him, its form barely human. Its face was a grotesque mask of melted features, its eyes black voids that seemed to pull him in. "Leave," the word distorted and guttural. "You don't belong here." Jason stumbled backward, his legs giving out as he fell to the floor. The figure moved closer, its long, spindly arms reaching for him. Desperation overtook him, and he fumbled for his camera, blindly snapping photo after photo as the figure loomed over him. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it vanished. The whispers ceased, and the room fell silent once more. Jason didn't wait to question it. He bolted from the basement, up the stairs, and out of the hospital, his flashlight flickering back to life as he reached the safety of his car. The next morning, Jason developed the photos. Most were blurry or overexposed, but one image chilled him to his core. It was the photo of the chair in the circular room. Standing behind it was the figure, its empty eyes staring directly at the camera. Jason never published his story, and he never returned to Crescent Pines. To this day, he keeps the photo locked away, a grim reminder that some places are haunted not by spirits, but by the echoes of unspeakable horrors. The nursing home sat at the edge of town, surrounded by dense woods that whispered in the wind. Maple Hollow Care Center had once been a bustling facility, but over the years, rumors began to circulate about strange occurrences within its walls. Staff would quit without notice, residents claimed to see shadows that no one else could, and some rooms were said to be off-limits for reasons no one dared to explain. On a cold November night, Emma, a new hire, began her first shift. She was covering the overnight slot, a quiet time meant for routine checks and paperwork. As a nurse in her late 20s, she was accustomed to long hours and strange stories, but nothing could have prepared her for what she was about to experience. Her shift began uneventfully. The residents were all asleep, the halls dimly lit and silent except for the occasional creak of the old building settling. Around midnight, Emma was reviewing charts at the nurse's station when the call light for room 12 blinked on. She frowned. Room 12 was unoccupied, had been for years, according to the charge nurse who'd trained her. Curious, Emma grabbed her flashlight and made her way down the hall. The corridor leading to room 12 felt colder than the rest of the building, the air heavy with an unidentifiable scent, something metallic and damp. When she reached the door, she hesitated. The nameplate was blank, but the door was ajar, a faint light spilling into the hallway. "Hello?" Emma called out, pushing the door open. The room was empty. The bed was made, untouched, and the air inside was icy. She was about to turn back when she noticed something odd. On the nightstand was a small, old-fashioned music box. It wasn't there during her orientation, she was sure of it. The box was intricately carved with images of leaves and twisted vines, and the lid was slightly open. As she approached, the music box began to play a haunting melody on its own. The tune was slow, eerie, and unfamiliar, each note resonating in the stillness. Emma's heart raced as she reached out to close the lid. The moment she did, the music stopped abruptly, and the call light above the bed flickered before going out. Shaking off the unease, Emma decided to leave the room. As she stepped into the hallway, she froze. At the far end, just barely visible in the dim light, stood a figure. It was a woman, dressed in what looked like an old nurse's uniform, her face obscured by shadow. Emma opened her mouth to speak, but the figure turned and walked away, disappearing around the corner. Emma hurried after her, her footsteps echoing in the silence. When she rounded the corner, the hallway was empty. Confused and slightly unnerved, she returned to the nurse's station and tried to focus on her work. But her mind kept drifting back to the music box and the woman she had seen. At 2 a.m., another call light blinked on, this time from room 18. Room 18 was occupied by Mrs. Carter, a bedridden resident known for her lucid dreams and mutterings about visitors in the night. Emma entered the room and found Mrs. Carter wide awake, staring at the ceiling with wide, fearful eyes. "They're here," Mrs. Carter whispered, her voice trembling. "Who's here, Mrs. Carter?" Emma asked, her skin prickling. "The others," the old woman said. "They don't like it when someone touches their things." Emma's stomach dropped. "What do you mean?" Mrs. Carter didn't answer. Instead, she turned her head slowly toward the window. Following her gaze, Emma saw something that made her blood run cold. Outside, barely illuminated by the moonlight, was the same woman she had seen in the hallway earlier. But now, the figure's face was visible, and it was wrong. The woman's eyes were sunken and empty, her mouth twisted into a grotesque smile that stretched impossibly wide. She stared directly at Emma, unmoving, unblinking. Then, in the span of a heartbeat, she was gone, vanishing into the shadows of the trees. Emma stumbled backward, her breathing ragged. She turned back to Mrs. Carter, but the woman was now silent, her eyes closed as if she had never been awake. The rest of the night passed in a blur of paranoia and dread. Emma avoided the hallways, staying close to the nurse's station until her shift finally ended. As the morning staff arrived, she debated whether to mention what had happened, but the fear of being dismissed as just another spooked newbie kept her silent. Before leaving, Emma passed by room 12 one last time. The door was shut, the nameplate still blank. On impulse, she opened the door. The music box was gone. She quit the job the next day, refusing to step foot in Maple Hollow again. Weeks later, Emma stumbled across an article online. It was an old news clipping about the nursing home, dated decades earlier. The story described a nurse who had worked there, a woman who had died tragically in a fire that had started in the basement. Her name was Evelyn, and she was last seen trying to rescue patients in room 12. The article included a photo of Nurse Evelyn. Emma's stomach churned as she recognized the face, the same twisted, smiling face she had seen that night. To this day, Emma avoids old buildings and refuses to speak about Maple Hollow. But sometimes, in the quiet moments of the night, she swears she can hear the faint, ghostly melody of a music box playing just beyond her door.